Hello, I'm Matt Baum, and welcome to the Sewers of Paris. We're on a podcast search for the entertainment that changed the lives of queer people. On this week's episode, gay newspapers, Pink Floyd, and That Certain Summer. My guest this week is Robert Steele, author of a new book about a figure in the early modern gay liberation movement that you've probably never heard of. Robert's subject is Jim Fauché, a teen runaway who landed in Los Angeles in the middle of a time of incredible social upheaval. He was also Robert's good friend, and between the two of them, there are some incredible stories about gay life in the 1950s onward. We'll have that conversation in a minute. First, a reminder to check out my YouTube channel where I post videos of queer pop culture. I just published a new one about Jim Nabors, The Andy Griffith Show, and a scandalous fake marriage that nearly ended two closeted actors' careers. And head over to my Patreon to watch hours of bonus videos featuring stories of TV and film history. Also check out my cute little newsletter where I share sneak peeks at what I'm working on next at mattbaum.com. Big thanks to everyone who supports the Sewers of Paris at patreon.com/mattbaum, and to everybody who's left a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Now, here's Robert. Well, this week I'm speaking to Robert Steele, an author, reporter, producer at various radio and television stations, a volunteer activist with the early gay liberation movement in Colorado, and a government public affairs officer. Robert, thank you so much for joining me.
Hello, Matt. It is wonderful to be with you. I've listened to some of your podcasts and a lot of your work that you're doing, like the TV programs that you talk about. And you're really prolific, and I really admire you for all the volunteer work you're doing for the community. I really look up to you.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That's really great to hear. I'm really glad that you like what I'm doing.
I wish more people would get involved.
Well, I'm happy just to be speaking to folks. As long as they're listening, I'll keep talking.
Sounds great.
Well, so what is the entertainment that changed your life?
Well, a couple of things. Of course, in the 70s and the 80s, we started getting movies about gay life. Before then, you never saw anything about that.
Do you remember which ones, like, or like the first one that you saw? I mean, that would have been around the time of the Boys in the Band and some of the others.
Yeah, Boys in the Band, I saw that, but I really wasn't impressed with that. I thought that did us more harm than good. Mm-hmm. Some of the others, let's see, what were they? A Certain Summer was on TV.
Yeah, that's Hal Holbrook, right?
That's right. Yes, that was good. And there were a host of other ones. I can't remember a lot of the names offhand. You know, I'm getting old right now. I'm in my 70s, and my mind and brain doesn't work as fast as it used to.
Mm-hmm. What was it like, you know, when you suddenly saw, after a period of gay stuff never appearing on screen, or at least, you know, really needing to go to the right underground sort of places to find it. Were you seeing that, like, in the context of, like, knowing other gay people? And was it something that you talked about?
Yes. I came out pretty much in the late 60s, 1969 and 1970. I was in San Diego, and I went to some of the gay bars there. But I was in the military at the time, and I was scared to death that they'd come in, that the Shore Patrol and military police would come in and drag my ass out of those bars. And then when I moved to Denver in 1972, I then immersed myself in the gay community, and I had friends. And it was interesting seeing the very first gay shows and TV programs and all coming out. Another one that I remembered that we loved that came out, I think, in the late 70s was Morris.
Oh, yeah.
It's spelled like it's Maurice, but the English pronounce that word Morris. Mm-hmm. And what a movie. We all loved that one. And so it was quite different, finally, having some positive shows, movies and TV shows about gay people on the media. And another thing that really changed me was in the late 60s and all, we had all this new music that was coming out. You had Pink Floyd that was very eerie, and you had the Moody Blues talking about love, and Led Zeppelin, and the music also had a big impact on us.
Yeah, there's so much of this I want to ask you about. Let's start with San Diego. You mentioned, like, how risky it was because you're in the military. What, you know, for as risky as it would have been if you'd been caught. This may seem like an obvious question, but I'm curious about your response. why go to the gay bars? Why take the risk to go to those bars if there was such a downside to the police coming in and catching you there?
Well, I don't know. I guess I was dumb and full of spunk at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I did it. I don't know why I can explain it away, but I was just compelled to want to do that. And the thing is that the shore patrol and the military police actually never came into those bars. Uh, so that really wasn't all that scary. But I remember that when I went on a new ship in San Diego, that there was a story that the military police on board ship caught two guys in one of the shore boats on the ship up on the deck, and they were under the canopy, and of course they were marched right out of the military because they were caught. So if you were caught back then in the late 60s and the early 70s, you were drummed out right away.
What got you into and was it the Navy or the Coast Guard?
I was in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, in 1968, I decided that I wanted to go and see the world, and I actually did. I was in Asia, in a lot of countries there, and then the last year or two of my enlistment, I was in Europe. I think I was lucky. I had a good time in the military.
Were there other closeted gay people that you were aware of?
Yes, there were other gay people. I met a couple. I was very, very closeted back then. And I was closeted in the military too. I didn't want a lot of people to know about me because, of course, if they knew about you, for sure, you would have been drummed out. And although there were a lot of people in the military who really didn't care, it was the authorities in the military who had to enforce the rules. They were the ones who really cared.
And now you said you're in San Diego and then Colorado in late 60s, early 70s. That would have been right around when Stonewall and the first Pride or Liberation marches were happening. How aware were you of that stuff?
Well, at the time of Stonewall, that was a big story in New York. But believe it or not, at that time, it was not a big story across the USA. We in San Diego and especially in Denver, the guys in Denver, hardly anybody knew that it had happened. The first thing that any of us were aware of was about 3 or 4 weeks after Stonewall, a story appeared in The Advocate, which at that time was the big publication, the biggest gay publication in the world. And it reran a story. They reprinted a story from the newsletter in New York of the Mattachine Society, the Mattachine Society of New York. And that's how we found out about it, because none of us saw it on any of the national media, any of the TV programs, TV news, or newspapers. But as the years passed by, Stonewall became more and more important, and people knew about it a lot more as time went on, because at that time there had already been 3 or 4 significant riots and uprisings in California and elsewhere the years before Stonewall. But back then, before Stonewall, family newspapers just didn't report things about homosexuality. They thought that that family newspapers were not the place to be reporting those sorts of things. But as 1969 came around, it was a radical time in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Mainstream Americans were dazed by a multitude of radical changes, social changes like endless riots and protests against racial discrimination and the Vietnam War. And then you had protests for free speech and women's rights and the environments. And then you also even had a lot of publicity about hippies and expanded consciousness and marijuana, psychedelics, LSD, and finally free love and, of all things, men with long hair. That was very
Hmm.
radical about back then, and that was a big bone of contention among the public. And I could go on, but at that time, activists often worked in more than one movement, and we were constantly transferring experiences and knowledge back and forth from one movement to another, including the gay civil rights movement.
When did you get involved in that? Was that after were you still in the military at that time, or what was?
No, I did not get involved in gay politics while I was in the military. And it's a good thing I did not, because back then I would have been caught and drummed out of the military.
Yeah.
But a few months later, I got out in summer of 1972 and went to Denver. And once I was in Denver, then I did get involved in politics with the Gay Coalition of Denver, and also with a couple of gay radio shows.
What brought you to Denver?
Well, I had always loved the Colorado mountains. And when I went home
Hmm.
from Denver, I met a friend there, and he lived in the Denver area. And I thought, you know what? I think that's where I'll move. And so I just up and moved there on my own. I was fancy free, and I hightailed it to
Hmm.
Denver, and that's where I lived for over a decade.
What sort of activism did you do, and how did you get involved?
Well, I heard about the Gay Coalition of Denver, and I called them up and got to know some of the guys. And one of the things I did was I worked on their outreach. We had a group that would go to colleges and speak to medical groups and all sorts of groups about gay people and
Hmm.
homosexuality. And we tried to do some one-on-one, for lack of a better word, publicity about what we were all about, and try to tear down the myths of
Hmm.
homosexuals.
How did that go? How were you received by straight audiences?
Believe it or not, we were received very well. Of
Hmm.
course, it's probably because we were invited by people who were very curious and probably somewhat moved by our experiences. Of course, people in the right wing would not want to
Hmm.
invite a group of uh, queers, homos, to their groups. So they were already predisposed uh, toward listening to us, the groups that invited us.
Nationally, like, what was the attitude toward gay people? Like, what did people, what was the general approach? You said that you were essentially doing PR, you're educating people. Like, what kind of questions did they have, and what sort of misconceptions did you need to clear up?
Well, at that time, we all thought we were on the threshold of very positive expectations, and we were making exciting strides in this new gay civil rights movement that we were all embarking on. The public perception of us was changing little by little. It was a new time of gay militancy, and
Hmm.
homosexuality was being discussed more openly for the first time by society and the media.
What were the expectations, and what could you do, or what did it feel like you could do that you couldn't before?
Well, we could talk about ourselves and read about ourselves, and the media was a big part of that. They want to get audiences, and they found out around the time of Stonewall that homosexuality would get audiences. I had a friend that I wrote a book about, Jim Fauché, and he would call up a talk radio station. Hello, I'm your friendly homosexual, and he would talk about homosexuality, and a program that would be somewhat dull. All of a sudden, when he got off the phone, that talk radio show was inundated with callers who wanted to talk about homosexuality. So the media found out, hey, we've got quite an audience with this subject. Let's keep it up, improve our statistics.
Well, tell me about Jim, because he's the subject of a new book.
For my book, Banned from California, I researched old historical records and articles from LGBT newspapers and magazines and journals. And I also got information from government documents and personal letters and from various audio recordings. And Banned from California is a biography about Jim Fauché's life. But it's really a lot more than that. It's a book and a look about a certain time in LGBT history and the culture of gay civil rights movement in the USA that serves as a backdrop for Jim's life and all of his many, many travels. And we see 70 years of American culture through the eyes of this gay American.
How did you first come into contact with him?
Well, Jim and I met in the early 1970s gay liberation movement. And he would tell me stories about his life. A couple of decades later, in the 1990s, I sat down and did a series of interviews of Jim for Banned from California. But at that time, I was working full time and simply did not want to work on the book in my evenings and on my weekends. So it wasn't until about 20 years later, after I retired, that I earnestly began writing the book. And about 7-8 years ago, I realized I had to start getting Banned from California written and published because I absolutely could not let this important story be lost to history. It was a story that absolutely had to be told and offered to people.
When you met him, what was your impression of what kind of person Jim was?
Well, Jim had gone through quite a life. His life was a lot different than mine. He worked in the gay liberation movement also. And at that time, he had met another gay guy who was a professional historian who worked for the Colorado Historical Society. And Jim got interested in gay history, and he became a researcher. He started reading at a very early age, about 3 years old, when he was in an orphanage. And he kept reading from that time on. And that's why he told me he thought that's why he became a speed reader. After he got out on his own, when he was in his late teens and early 20s, and throughout his life, he would go to a library and check out a dozen books. And within a week, he'd have them all read, and he'd be itching to take them all back to the library and check out another dozen books. So when he found out about gay history, he started looking into that and doing research. And he read hundreds of books and went through decades of old, crusty newspapers. And he would read them, and all of a sudden a story would pop out at him, a headline or whatever, and he would find another lead on a gay story, and then he would do more research and back up that story.
So it sounds like he was really a kind of a treasure hunter, like going through these old documents and artifacts and things, looking for the stories that, as you mentioned, it was something that newspapers felt was too scandalous or inappropriate to write about. So, something that, in doing my own research, I know that you often have to read between the lines and search for hidden stories and kind of cross-reference one story to another story. It sounds like that was sort of work that Jim was doing back in the 70s, when I imagine it was much more difficult.
Oh, yeah. There was no such thing, of course, as the internet. He would have to go through these dusty old newspapers, and he would spend hours and hours doing that.
Where would those stories wind up?
Well, he did thousands and thousands of pages that he collected on gay history. And when the book was published, I was going to take all of his massive files to Denver for the Western History Department of the Denver Public Library. But the pandemic hit, and my husband and I did not travel. And so I've still got those with me. And when it's safe, I want to go to Denver and take those massive files and donate them to the Denver Public Library.
Wow, that sounds like an incredible treasure trove. Can you give me a sense for what kind of stories are in there?
Well, he's got stories about women who married women, and men who married men, and gay cowboys, and cowboys who were girls, and women who were cowboys, and women's colonies, and one called the Boys' Secret Society, and miners and hermits and hobos and tramps, and same-sex kissing in public, and early laws and medical reports, and women outlaws, and military stories, and prison and jail stories and statistics, and Native Americans. And he has also got stories about Clear Creek, Colorado in the 1850s, and the Birdcage Bar, and sex scandals, and Oscar Wilde in the USA, and Walt Whitman, and early gay activist groups, and the Mattachine Society, and the Neighbors, and many, many, many others.
Yeah, so this sounds like it really spans going back to the 1800s.
Oh yeah, most of his stories were of the 1800s, and he had a few from 1920 and earlier, but he concentrated mainly on the gay West. His friend, who was the historical professional historian, he was going to write a book about the gay Old West, but he died and was not able to do that. And so the files are still there. And like I said, I would have donated them by now, but we have not gotten a chance to drive back to Denver. Hopefully, maybe this coming summer or so, it'll be safe for us to travel there. We're old enough where that we want to be real careful.
Oh yeah, of course. And it sounds like this is a really, just invaluable collection that you've got. Is it literally? Are we talking about like boxes of papers and physical documents?
Yes, they're all physical documents. They were mimeographed, or no, they were Xeroxed from newspapers and magazines, and most of them are from old microfilm and microfiche, because at that time in the 1970s and 80s, libraries had transferred their public files from actual newspapers and magazines onto microfilm. So a lot of them, but you can tell that they're very, very old copies, and they're there waiting for people to do research, and I cannot wait to get them taken to Denver so the people there can. I might also make copies for the One Archives in LA, California, but we'll see.
Yeah, gosh, I mean, it sounds like an incredible resource. How did and so Jim was just collecting this stuff, it sounds like, for himself, or did he have plans to put it into a book or bring it somewhere?
Jim's plans were to write a book, and I was helping him, but I had to do it on my nights and weekends. And after working, I just didn't feel like working away my whole life. And so it was very slow writing, and Jim did the research, and I was writing a lot of this material up. but then he got sick at the turn of the
Hmm.
century, and that project stopped. And I've got in some of his files some of the stories that we wrote up, the rough drafts,
Hmm.
and they'll be available for people to do research also.
Well, and tell me about you're working together. It sounds like you really collaborated for many years. Was that the case? Like, and you were in Denver. I think you said from the early '70s and then through the early '80s. Is that correct?
That's right. And then I moved to Arizona, and Jim and my friend Jeff Sperano also moved to Arizona, and Jim moved to Arizona. So here we were, all of these
Hmm.
Denverites who were leaving Colorado and moving to warmer climates in Arizona.
Was it just the climate? What brought you there?
I was here because of a job offer. I had always worked in news media, and for years I served as a reporter and producer at various radio and TV stations in Colorado and Arizona. I'd been a broadcaster at the Italian National Broadcasting Company. It was called RAI, Radio Televisione Italiana, and that was in Naples. And I'd been a reporter for Armed Forces Radio and TV along the coast of Vietnam and the Asian Western Pacific. And so there was an opportunity to work as a federal government public affairs officer for the U.S. Department of the
Hmm.
Interior here in Arizona. And it paid a lot of good money, more than I was making at any of the radio or TV stations. And so I took it, and I served as a government spokesperson, and I managed media relations with reporters who actually worked for media outlets across the USA and even around the world. And so that's what brought me down to Arizona.
Hmm.
And Jeff moved here because he was tired of Denver, and Jim never liked the cold
Hmm.
weather, and he loved the heat. In fact, he liked the summers in Arizona more than the winters, if you can figure that out.
Sure. Well, there's a very particular kind of temperament. Like a lot of my friends in Palm Springs, it's not for me, but I understand that they like I guess, the bathing suit weather.
Oh yeah, Palm Springs is getting very, very big in their
Hmm.
LGBT community. In fact, there are gobs and gobs of people who used to live in San Francisco. It seems like all of a sudden they've all moved the past decade or two to Palm
Yeah.
Springs.
Yeah. I certainly like it. It's amazing to me. I have a lot of friends from LA who've moved there as well. So I don't know. It's a new migration, I guess. When you moved to Arizona to work for the federal government, was there any concern about you being gay and having to keep it secret? If that was I don't know, security or just if the attitude of your coworkers might not have been hospitable to having a gay person working in the office?
Well, they all, by that time I was in my mid 30s, and by that time people were a lot more sophisticated about instead of somebody being an old bachelor,
Hmm.
if they, as they were called in the 50s, if you were unmarried, and I was at the time I moved to Arizona, most of them, it wasn't hard to figure out that, well, this guy's unmarried and he doesn't have a girlfriend or anything, so he must be gay. And everybody treated me with respect, at least on the surface, and I really had no problems. And I didn't really have any problems with any
Hmm.
coworkers.
Were you still involved in activism? Were you still, an organizer in your free time?
No, not when I went to Arizona. I figured
Hmm.
I'd put in a lot of my time as an activist, and I did writing. Of course, I did writing in my entire career also. But as far as belonging to any groups, no, I didn't. I had put in my time and paid my dues, so to speak. And I was no longer real active in the movement.
What was the community like? What was the gay community in Arizona? And what part of Arizona were you in?
I was in a small town in southwest Arizona, Yuma,
Hmm.
Arizona,
Okay.
and it wasn't very big, so there essentially was no organized gay community down here. Although now, here it is, the new century, they've got a gay group, and off and on they have a gay center, and they've got
Hmm.
a PFLAG group down here. So it's a lot different now. But when I moved down here, there wasn't anything in this small town. But we're right smack dab in the middle of Phoenix and San Diego. So
Mm.
I would spend a lot of time in those two cities to kind of get myself refreshed into the gay communities there. I have a good life down in Arizona.
What was it like to go back to those cities? I imagine, like, through the '80s and into the '90s, every time you went back, it must have been things must have been changing very quickly.
Oh, it was very refreshing. It was
Hmm.
like a different world. Here in the desert, the gay community was like a desert.
Hmm.
There wasn't much of one, and it was very refreshing to be in San Diego and Phoenix, where they had gay organizations and LGBT rights groups. Yeah, I loved it. I had have a good life. It helped because after I moved here, right after I moved here, I met my lifelong partner, and we have,
How did you meet?
uh, well, of all things, we met at work. And
Hmm.
at first, we did not know that each other was gay. And I would have groups that did certain things that I would commission, and different volunteers would join that group. And my present husband, he would join those groups, and I thought, well, he's got a lot of spirit and
Hmm.
coming in and helping the organization. And then after we got together, he said, I didn't join those organizations for that. I joined them to be near you. And eventually, a friend of ours told me about him being gay, and so we eventually hooked up, and we've been together 36 years, and we
Hmm.
recently got married.
Wow, congratulations. I mean, gosh, what a great little story that, somebody is right there in the same, you just happen to be in the right place at the right time. Both of you with your careers bringing you together.
Oh, yeah, I had three or four chances to further my career and, go other places in the federal government, but I stayed here for him
Mhm.
because he is such a loving person. Everybody loves Joe, and I do mean that. Uh,
Mm.
he's quite a person.
I get the impression from, reading about that time, the '80s. I was just a kid, so I didn't have a great awareness, but that there were a lot of forces that were working against, either, longevity for a couple, either getting together and making it through, just in terms of social stigma, of course, with the epidemic. So, it seems like for a gay couple to have found each other, to have been able to withstand all the social stigma of the time, and all the stress of the time. I mean, that must have not have been an easy or small thing to have been able to achieve.
Yes, those times in the 1980s, things were changing, and it wasn't really all that hard for us because we had each other. But
Mm.
earlier, in the 1960s, I experienced it, and especially Jim Fauché, who I wrote the book Banned from California about. He really experienced it. He was born back in 1939, and he eventually became an activist and researcher. But back in the 1950s, at 15 years old, he ran away from an abusive home in Idaho and he landed in the 1950s in Los Angeles's underground world of homosexuals and early queer culture. And he unwittingly ended up an eyewitness
Hmm.
to the beginnings of the LGBTQ civil rights movement, the gay rights movement. And in this book, Banned from California, readers experience Jim's adventures and misadventures, and they live history as seen through the eyes of this gay American.
Yeah, he would have been there, I think, just in time for Mattachine and for Harry Hay and all that stuff, right?
Oh, that's right. Like I said, in 1954, Jim hitchhiked 800 miles away from his abusive family, and he set out on an adventure that redefined his life and put him in the midst of the civil rights struggle of gay people across the USA, and it spans a half century. And Banned from California includes a lot of anecdotes of people that Jim met and places he traveled to, drag queens and hustlers and good cops and bad cops, and as well as brushes with the Beats and the hippies and the early 1970s gay liberation movement. Uh, he saw years and years of LGBTQ American culture.
Hmm.
Um, you know, he was institutionalized in his early life, and he escaped that life, and he became when he became a civil rights activist, he found a cause worth living for. And instead of experienced and being at the mercy of the persecution in those years, he put his destiny into his own hands, and he became an activist, and he felt a lot better for it. And that's why I would encourage younger people nowadays, get involved and you'll feel a lot better about your life, and that you're not at the mercy of people who have hate for
Hmm.
you.
What is the title in reference to? Was he actually banned from California?
Well, he was. When he first ran away to Los Angeles, he met a drag queen who took him in and provided a sanctuary from the life of the streets. And he felt very safe because, as he said, he had his own bedroom under the watchful eye of Bunny, whose bedroom was next to his, and he felt safe. But Bunny's partner or lover at that time was away, and he was visiting relatives in Montana. And when he came back a couple of weeks later, he was nonplussed
Mhm.
in seeing this young runaway living in their home. And he told Bunny, "This kid's got to go." And so Jim was essentially kicked out of the refuge, his home there. He thought, well, it's about time to hightail it back to Idaho, and he decided he would hitchhike. But in LA, he didn't know how to get out of LA. Once he could get out of LA, he knew how to hitchhike the rest of the 800 miles back.
Mm.
So he went to a park and he saw a policeman, and he remembered what his mother always told him: a policeman is your most important friend. A policeman will always help you. So he saw a policeman in the park, and he went up to him and he asked him if he could get help getting out of Los Angeles because he wanted to hitchhike home. And the
Mm.
policeman all of a sudden realized that he had a runaway on his hands. So Jim asked him if he could get a ride out of town, and the policeman said yes. And Jim wanted to know how to get to the police station, and the policeman was so helpful that not only would he help Jim, but he took him to the police station himself. And of course, they knew
Hmm.
there that Jim was a runaway, and they played him like a fiddle. He was young and
Hmm.
had no experience, and they finally got out of him where he had been living and who had helped him and all. And they had him sign papers. He didn't know what he was signing. And so instead of going home like they promised him, they took him to the jail for juvenile delinquents. And he spent quite a few weeks there. And finally, one day, the authorities came and said that he was going to go to the court the following day. And Jim said, "Oh, am I in trouble?" And they said, "No, just go to court and tell the judge the truth." And Jim thought, "Oh, okay." And so he went there for his case. And all of a sudden, he went into this big courtroom and he was put on the stand. And there in front of him, sitting in the first row, was the drag queen and her partner or her lover. And they were dressed in suits. And the prosecutor asked Jim if, being a good boy, that he knew the difference between telling the truth and not. And Jim said yes. And the prosecutor wanted to know what he had been doing in Los Angeles. And Jim started telling it. And the prosecutor mentioned that Jim had been doing these activities, including terms that Jim didn't understand, like oral sodomy and other things. And they did not use common language that Jim would know, like queer. But when the prosecutor explained it to the audience, they were shocked. And all of a sudden, Jim figured out, "Oh, I know what they're doing." And he said he couldn't let them put his drag queen friend and her lover in jail. They didn't belong in jail. And so Jim said, "No, it's not true. The police made me say it." And the courtroom erupts. And the judge eventually told the social worker, "I want to see this boy in my chambers." And so they went back there, and the judge started going on and on. "We could have sent them up for years. For the life of me, I can't understand why you lied about it." And the judge said, "Now we can just go back into court and we can ignore your testimony and have you start again." And Jim said, "No, I won't do it." And the judge got mad and blew his top and said, "You go back home and you stay with your parents in Idaho. You cannot come back here to California. I ban you from the state of California."
Gee.
At the time, Jim was so young, he didn't know if the courts really could ban him or not. And so for the next few years, although he thought he was banned from California, it didn't stop him. He kept running back and forth to California over and over. In Banned from California, I detail Jim's young life being institutionalized. First, he was institutionalized in an orphanage when he was 3 years old. His older sister, Ruthie, was 8 years old at the time, and she'd already experienced the loss of her daddy, who had died the year before. And then in the orphanage, she had to deal with the emotional trauma of being alone in a strange place without either parent. And Jim was so young at 3 years old that he told me he really didn't remember anything about entering the orphanage. So he didn't remember how he initially dealt with it. But after 3 years that the kids spent in the orphanage, Jim's mother brought the kids back home to live with her, and they settled in together. But Jim could not remember anything about his mother before living in the orphanage. And he said that she seemed like a nice lady, but he couldn't remember anything about her. He told me he didn't think he was really capable of bonding with her because he'd already lived half of his young life at the orphanage without his mother. And so she married Jim's first stepfather, whose discipline that he metered out amounted to beating Jim and his sister whenever the stepfather thought the two children came under the influence of the devil.
Mm.
And this apparently happened so often that during one particular week, Jim ran away from home every
Mm.
day. So, at the age 13, Jim was placed in a reform school to correct his runaway tendencies and other incorrigible behavior. And there, the older juvenile delinquents took sexual advantage of Jim, but Jim really couldn't tell these guys no. Uh, they just took what they wanted from Jim. So eventually, a few weeks later, the reform school staff found out that a lot of the older teenagers were having sexual encounters with Jim, and the house fathers thought Jim was at fault and told him that he was a bad influence on the older juvenile delinquents. So the training school's medical staff determined that Jim was mentally ill with severe social maladjustment problems, and they transferred the 14-year-old out of the reform school and into Idaho State Mental Hospital. And from then through the rest of his teenage years, Jim lived mainly at that mental institution. And although the mental hospital was a fairly progressive mental institution during the 1960s, they eventually concluded that Jim was not mentally ill, but their main concern about Jim was that they were afraid that he was becoming institutionalized all over again at the mental hospital, and they tried various techniques to reintegrate him back into society. However, Jim was a lot more comfortable away from home and away from society and could never wait to get back to the mental hospital where his real friends lived. He felt that he could not be truthful and tell people outside the hospital who he really was, because after all, not only was he homosexual and running off to California, but he was living most of his life, most of his teenage life, in a mental institution.
You know, it really drives home how the institutions, mental institution and police and courts and all that stuff really was stacked against gay people and LGBTQ people, for as long as anything has been recorded, as long as it's been an issue.
Life was tough for homosexuals. In the 1950s, homosexual acts were illegal in all of the states across the USA. And at that time, even the American Civil Liberties Union asserted that civil rights did not pertain to homosexuals. And my squads were always on the lookout for homosexuals. And if you were convicted of sodomy, you could spend years in prison. In the early 1950s, during the McCarthy era, you had U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy embarking on his highly publicized quest to rid the government of communists and homosexuals. And the U.S. House of Representatives, their House Un-American Activities Committee, they also investigated communists and homosexuals. And also, President Dwight Eisenhower issued an executive order declaring that sexual perversion was grounds for homosexuals to be fired from their jobs. But throughout this time, Jim lived an openly gay teenage life in the 1950s, and doing that was seen as criminal behavior at the time. So, Banned from California places Jim's story within the context of the gay civil rights movement during the Cold War and McCarthyism.
Gosh, it's on one hand, it just is so unimaginable in the setting of today to think that that was ever the case, but also that was happening within living memory. Like it's not that long ago. With all the change that you've lived through and that you can read about in the research that Jim did, do you find, like, is there a common thread through LGBTQ people from the beginning of Jim's story in the 1930s up till today? Like, is there something that ties lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, etc. people together?
Well, Jim told me a lot about that time. Gay America was in the shadows, and it was a secret subculture. It had its own clubs and customs and even
Mm,
code words. Jim always dated older men. He didn't care that much for guys his own age or younger guys. And he told me that he thought the word gay was cool to use, but that put off some older
mm,
guys that he dated. They thought that Jim and other younger guys were ruining a good code word
mm.
by popularly using gay, and they were afraid that before long, guys would be afraid to ask anybody if they were gay because everybody else would have learned what gay meant.
Mhm.
And also, whenever he left a gay bar with an older guy, they'd end up walking 2 or 3 or 4 blocks to the older guy's car because these guys never ever parked next to a gay bar. These men usually had good jobs and they didn't want their livelihoods threatened by
Mm.
an arrest.
Yeah, gosh, there's the peril that must have just been looming at all times. It's just hard to imagine what that would do to a person and how that affects a person's life to always be looking over your shoulder.
Well, it was interesting because the true turning point in those times was the rise of the gay press,
Mm,
of all things. It was a radical new type of publication that permeated the fledgling gay rights movement at that time. And the first magazine that began publishing was in 1953, and most people have never heard of it. It was called One Magazine, and it was the first enduring gay publication in the USA. It was about the size of Reader's Digest, but it contained fewer
mhm.
pages, only about 2 or 3 dozen pages per issue. But by 1957, they printed about 3,000 monthly copies, and they were sold through subscriptions. And believe it or not, they were also sold at newsstands. And one essentially marked the true beginning of the gay press, and one positioned itself into the forefront of the emerging queer movement, and it awakened homosexuals nationwide. It's interesting. Most straight
Mm,
people were unaware of One Magazine, but straight people who did pay attention to it were scared by the magazine because now instead of finding a communist under every bed, they were finding a queer there.
mhm.
Uh, and anyway, a couple of years after One started publishing it, the U.S. government, the U.S. Post Office, impounded the magazine's October 1954 edition. And the post office called the magazine obscene and filthy. And the post office refused to deliver One through the mail. So One took the post office to court in Los Angeles and they lost. The judge ruled that the magazine obviously was calculated to
Mm,
stimulate the lust of homosexual readers. And so One appealed the judge's ruling to the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they lost again. The appeals court ruled that articles in the magazine were nothing more than cheap pornography, morally depraved and debased. So, after these two legal setbacks, One staff members were pretty much dejected and dispirited. But One's attorney wanted to take their case, of all things, to the U.S. Supreme Court. And One staff members were obviously pessimistic, but they went along with it and they okayed their attorney's plan of action. And eventually, the Supreme Court handed down its ruling. It did not even hear oral arguments, but the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in One's favor. The High Court reversed the two lower courts' opinions. It essentially ruled that One magazine's discussions of homosexuality was not obscene, that it was an exercise of free speech, and that homosexuals had the same right to freedom of the press as anybody else in the USA. And this was the first legal victory for homosexuals in the court system. And that important landmark decision is what made it possible for homosexual publications to exist, which in turn allowed the equal rights for homosexual movements to develop and advance. And one magazine fought and won that critical, crucial initial battle.
It's really amazing how important that access to media is. I mean, this goes back to what you were talking about at the very beginning of our conversation, how important films were in being able to see other gay people and know that they existed. It's just incredible how vital it is to have access to the ability to communicate and to assert your existence. And if people want to check out this book, where can they find your book about Jim?
Well, there are a couple places. Of course, they could look in their local bookstore and booksellers, but it's easier than running around trying to find it at a bookstore. Is simply either go to Amazon.com. It's in there under Banned from California, and that's BANNED, Banned from California. Or they can go to the website of Banned from California, which is bannedca.com. And either one of those are excellent places to order it and have it delivered right to your door.
Fantastic. Well, Robert, I can't wait to read this book and to see those documents once they're finally ready to donate. It sounds like there's just an amazing amount of information in there. Thanks so much for spending this time to chat with me.
Oh, you're welcome, Matt. What a wonderful conversation. And I love what you're doing and all the time you're spending to give to the movement and the cause. Congratulations. You're wonderful.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thanks to Robert for joining me, and thanks to you for listening. And thanks to everyone who makes the Sewers of Paris possible on Patreon. Head over to patreon.com/Matt Baum to support the show and get backer rewards like stickers in the mail and exclusive bonus videos. Check out my YouTube for deep dives into queer pop culture history at youtube.com/Matt Baum and my newsletter at mattbaum.com. The theme song for the Sewers of Paris is Parisian from filmmusic.io by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0. And until next time, croissant.